4 in the morning, May 10th, 1775, the mist rolls off Lake Champlain like smoke from a battlefield, and 83 colonial rebels are about to pull off the most audacious heist in American history. Their target, not gold, not jewels, something way more valuable to a struggling revolution. Fort Ticonderoga and its massive arsenal of cannons. This isn't just another battle story. This is farmers, hunters, and merchants who decided freedom was worth dying for. Today, we're diving into the human drama, the split-second decisions, the incredible courage that made this bold raid possible. Welcome back to Liberty Unfolded. I'm your host, and today we're uncovering the real story behind the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. A story that's been overshadowed by bigger battles, but might just be the most important victory you've never heard of. You're a colonial leader in May 1775. You just got the most terrifying intelligence report of your life. British General Thomas Gage, he's got 4,000 trained soldiers in Boston, warships in the harbor, professional artillery units, and the backing of the most powerful empire on earth. Your forces, a collection of farmers with hunting rifles, shopkeepers with pitchforks, and maybe, if you're lucky, a few veterans from the French and Indian War who remember which end of a musket to point at the enemy. This is the nightmare scenario facing colonial leadership. Just weeks after Lexington and Concord, the shots heard round the world have been fired. But now what? How do you fight the British Empire with what amounts to an armed mob? Here's the brutal math keeping these men awake at night. British artillery can level entire city blocks. Their naval guns can reduce coastal towns to rubble. Their field cannons can break up any colonial formation before it gets within musket range. And what do the colonists have? Exactly 0 heavy artillery pieces, not one cannon, not a single howitzer, nothing. Dr. Joseph Warren puts it bluntly, quote, "We are attempting to fight a giant with stones and slings." The colonists might have righteous anger on their side. But righteous anger doesn't stop a cannonball. Then, in a smoky tavern in Hartford, Connecticut, someone mentions Fort Ticonderoga, and suddenly everyone in the room goes quiet. Picture this fortress. It's not just any fort, built by the French in the 1750s. A massive star-shaped stone fortress commanding the entire southern end of Lake Champlain. The walls are 12 feet thick in places. The bastions are designed to withstand siege warfare. During the French and Indian War, it was considered virtually impregnable. The British took it in 1759 after a brutal siege, but here's the thing. They've gotten complacent. Intelligence reports suggest maybe 40 British soldiers holding the entire fort, 40 men, controlling enough firepower to arm an entire army. Inside those walls sit 78 cannons of various sizes, 6 mortars, 3 howitzers, and enough gunpowder to level a mountain. There are also tons of muskets, bayonets, and other military supplies. It's like discovering your enemy left the keys to their armory hanging on a hook outside. But here's where it gets interesting and terrifying. Taking Fort Ticonderoga isn't just about military necessity. It's about crossing a line that can never be uncrossed. Up until now, the colonists could argue they were just defending themselves. Lexington and Concord were defensive actions. They were responding to British aggression, but attacking Fort Ticonderoga, that's an act of war, that's open rebellion, that's treason against the crown, punishable by death. The colonial leaders are staring at a choice that will define the next decade of American history. Stay defensive and probably lose the war, or take the offensive and risk everything. Because make no mistake, if this raid fails, if the men are captured, the British will make examples of them, public hangings, drawn and quartered, the full brutal spectacle of imperial justice. And it's not just the raiders who will pay the price. Their families will be branded as traitors. Their property will be confiscated. Their children will grow up as outcasts. So the question hanging in the air isn't just, can we take Fort Ticonderoga? It's are we ready to bet everything on this one desperate gamble? The answer comes down to a group of men who have already lost everything they could lose to British authority, men who have been pushed so far, they've got nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Let me tell you about the most unlikely hero in American history. A man who was technically an outlaw, a cattle rustler, and according to British authorities, a dangerous terrorist. His name was Ethan Allen, and he was about to change the course of the revolution. It's 1775. Ethan Allen is 6 feet tall in an age when the average man barely reaches 5'6". He's got shoulders like a bull, hands that can crush walnuts, and a voice that can literally be heard a mile away. When Ethan Allen speaks, people don't just listen, they feel it in their bones. But here's what makes Allen truly dangerous. He's not just physically imposing, he's brilliant. This is a man who taught himself philosophy, reads Enlightenment thinkers in his spare time, can quote Locke and Rousseau while skinning a deer. He's the rare combination of intellect and raw frontier toughness that the British Empire has never encountered before. Allen leads a group called the Green Mountain Boys. These aren't your typical colonial militia. These are men who have been living outside the law for years, fighting a guerrilla war against New York land speculators trying to steal their farms. They know every deer path, every hidden valley, every cave in the Green Mountains. They can disappear into the wilderness like ghosts and emerge wherever they want, whenever they want, and they're absolutely fearless. Why? Because they've already lost everything they could lose. The British-backed New York government has declared them outlaws. Their farms have been burned, their families scattered. They're already dead men walking in the eyes of the law. So what's one more capital offense? But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. While Allen and his boys are planning their assault on Fort Ticonderoga, the Massachusetts Committee of Safety is having the exact same idea. And they're sending their own man to take command. Enter Benedict Arnold. Yes, that Benedict Arnold, though at this point he's still wearing the white hat. Arnold is everything Ethan Allen isn't, educated at elite schools, successful in business, connected to the colonial establishment. He's got an official commission from Massachusetts, written authorization to take the fort, and the expectation that everyone will fall in line behind his authority. Arnold rides into Allen's camp expecting to take charge. What happens next is like watching two alpha wolves size each other up. Allen's boys are lounging around their campfires, cleaning their rifles, basically ignoring this well-dressed stranger who's just announced he's their new commander. Allen steps forward. You can feel the tension ratchet up. He's not just the leader of these men, he's their legend. For years, they've followed him through impossible odds. He's never let them down. Now this outsider wants to waltz in and take over. The confrontation is electric. Arnold waives his commission and demands recognition of his authority. Allen crosses his arms and basically says, "That's a nice piece of paper you've got there. But my boys don't take orders from anyone they haven't bled with." For a moment, it looks like the entire operation might collapse before it even begins. 83 men who should be preparing to attack a British fortress are instead watching their leaders have a territorial dispute. The British couldn't have disrupted the mission more effectively if they'd planned it themselves. But then something remarkable happens. These two massive egos, these two completely different men, find a solution that's both brilliant and completely insane. They'll both lead the attack, two commanders. One mission, and somehow they'll figure out how to make it work. It's a compromise that shouldn't work. But it does because both men realize something crucial. The mission is bigger than their personal pride. The cause of liberty is more important than who gets credit for the victory. Still, you can feel the tension crackling between them. Two strong-willed leaders, two different visions of how this should go down. And only one chance to get it right. It's like watching a powder keg with two fuses, and you're not sure which one's going to blow first. I need you to meet Remember Baker, and I need you to understand. This man's story is going to break your heart and inspire you at the same time. Remember Baker wasn't just Ethan Allen's cousin. He was a man who'd been systematically destroyed by the very system they were about to attack. Remember Baker had been a peaceful farmer, trying to raise his family in the Green Mountains. He'd cleared his land by hand, built his cabin log by log. He was living the colonial dream. Then the New York land speculators arrived, with their lawyers and their legal documents, claiming his farm belonged to them. When Baker refused to abandon the land he'd worked for years to build, they didn't just take him to court, they put a bounty on his head. Dead or alive, 50 pounds, enough money to buy a small farm. They burned his cabin while his family was inside. His wife and children barely escaped with their lives. They scattered his livestock, destroyed his crops, turned him into a hunted man in his own homeland. For Remember Baker, Fort Ticonderoga wasn't about abstract political principles. It was personal. It was about a system that had taken everything from him and left him with nothing but rage and a rifle. When he looked at that British fort, he saw every corrupt official, every bought judge, every land speculator who'd destroyed his life. But Baker wasn't the only one with skin in the game. Let me tell you about Noah Phelps, a man whose courage was so quiet, so understated, that history almost forgot him entirely. Phelps volunteered for the most dangerous job of all, reconnaissance. He would walk into Fort Ticonderoga, alone and unarmed, and gather the intelligence they needed to pull off the attack. Think about what this meant. If Noah Phelps was discovered, there would be no rescue mission, no prisoner exchange, no diplomatic intervention. He would be hanged as a spy, and his family would spend the rest of their lives knowing their father died at the end of a rope, branded as a traitor. But Phelps had a plan that was so audacious, it just might work. He would pose as a farmer looking for work, someone down on his luck who needed employment. He spent hours practicing his story, memorizing every detail of his fake background. The morning of his reconnaissance mission, Phelps walks right up to the gates of Fort Ticonderoga and asks to speak with the commander. The British soldiers, bored out of their minds in this remote posting, are actually happy to have someone to talk to. They invite him in, give him a tour of the fort, and spend the entire day chatting with this friendly farmer. For 8 hours, Noah Phelps counted soldiers, memorized the layout of the fort, noted the condition of the weapons, assessed the defenses. And the entire time, he's making small talk with the very men he's planning to attack in 48 hours. When he finally leaves the fort that evening, Phelps carries with him intelligence that would determine the success or failure of the entire mission. He knows there are only 42 British soldiers in the fort. He knows the main gate is poorly defended. He knows the garrison is complacent and unprepared for an attack. But here's the part that gives me chills. As Phelps walks away from Fort Ticonderoga, he passes several British soldiers who wave goodbye and wish him luck finding work. These men have no idea they've just spent the day with a spy who's about to change the course of American history. The night before the attack, these men are gathered by the shore of Lake Champlain. It's cold, it's dark, and they are about to commit an act that will brand them as traitors to the crown for the rest of their lives. Some of them are writing letters home, letters they hope their families will never have to read. Others are checking their weapons for the 100th time. A few are praying quietly, asking God to watch over their families if they don't make it back. But here's what strikes me most about this moment. These aren't professional soldiers. They're not trained commandos or elite special forces. They're farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and storekeepers. They're ordinary men who have been pushed too far, who have decided that some things are worth dying for. Remember Baker knows that if he dies tomorrow, his wife and children will be left with nothing. Noah Phelps knows that his successful spying mission has made him a marked man. But they're still here, still ready to cross that lake and attack a British fortress. Because sometimes ordinary people decide they've had enough. Sometimes regular folks look at injustice and oppression and say, "Not anymore, not on my watch." And that's when history changes forever. Here's where this story takes a turn that's going to make your heart race. The plan they've developed is simultaneously brilliant and completely insane, and it's about to go sideways in the most dramatic way possible. The strategy is deceptively simple. Cross Lake Champlain under cover of darkness, scale the walls of Fort Ticonderoga at dawn, capture the fortress before the British can mount any defense, no backup plan. No reinforcements, no escape route if things go wrong, just 80, 3 men, a handful of boats, and the element of surprise. But here's where you need to understand the geography. Lake Champlain isn't some peaceful pond. It's a massive body of water, over 100 miles long, up to 14 miles wide. The water is boned, chilling cold even in May. The weather can change in minutes, turning calm water into deadly waves that can swamp a small boat. In Fort Ticonderoga, it's not just sitting on the shore like some trading post. It's built on a rocky promontory that juts out into the lake. Surrounded by water on 3 sides, the walls are 12 feet high and built to withstand cannon fire. The British didn't choose this location by accident. It's designed to be impregnable. The night of May 9th, 1775, Allen and Arnold's men begin their approach. They've managed to gather a small fleet of boats. Some fishing vessels, a few canoes, whatever else they could commandeer. The men are packed in tight, weapons and equipment carefully balanced to avoid capsizing. But then, just as they are about to launch the main assault, disaster strikes. They can only find enough boats to transport half their force across the lake on the first trip. Half 40, 2 men instead of 83. Picture this moment. Dawn is breaking on the horizon, painting the sky that dangerous gray color that means they're running out of darkness. The British garrison will be waking up soon, and once the sun is fully up, any hope of surprise is gone. Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold are facing an impossible choice. Do they wait for the boats to make a second trip and risk losing the cover of darkness? Or do they attack with half their planned force and hope it's enough? Here's what makes this moment so incredible. Allen doesn't hesitate. He looks at those 42 men, wet, cold, exhausted from rowing across the lake, and he makes the decision that will define the entire operation. We go now with what we have. Think about the mathematics of what he's proposing. 42 colonial fighters against a fortified British position. No artillery support, no backup plan, no way to retreat if things go wrong. They're literally betting everything on the hope that surprise and audacity will be enough. The men begin their final approach to the fort. You can feel the tension ratcheting up with every step. They're moving in single file through the darkness, trying to avoid making any noise that might alert the British sentries. Every snapped twig, every whispered word, every metallic click of a weapon could mean the difference between success and disaster. As they reach the base of the fort's walls, Allen signals for the men to spread out and prepare for the assault. But here's the moment that shows you just how thin the line between success and failure really is. There's supposed to be a British sentry walking the walls, but he's nowhere to be seen. Is he asleep? Has he abandoned his post? Or is this a trap? Are they walking into an ambush? The men are crouched at the base of the wall, weapons ready, waiting for Allen's signal, and nobody knows what they are about to face. Allen makes the call. They're going over the wall now. The scaling of the fortress walls is a masterpiece of coordination and courage. These men, exhausted from the lake crossing, soaked to the bone, operating on pure adrenaline and determination, somehow managed to climb a 12-foot stone wall in near total darkness without making enough noise to alert the garrison. But here's where it gets really dramatic. As the first wave of men drops silently into the fort's courtyard, they realize they have no idea where the British soldiers are sleeping. The fort is enormous, multiple buildings, barracks, defensive positions. They could be walking into a trap, or they could have complete surprise, and then, just as they're trying to figure out their next move, they hear it, the sound of a single British sentry making his rounds. One man, walking alone, completely unaware that 42 armed rebels are hiding in the shadows just yards away. This is the moment when everything hangs in the balance. One shout from that sentry, one moment of alertness, and the entire operation falls apart. The British garrison wakes up, the alarm is raised, and Allen's men are trapped inside a fortress with no way out. But instead of raising the alarm, the sentry walks right into their trap. He's captured silently, efficiently, and suddenly the rebels control the main courtyard of Fort Ticonderoga. The impossible has become possible, and the most audacious gamble in American military history is about to pay off in the most spectacular way imaginable. What happens next is going to blow your mind, because the capture of Fort Ticonderoga doesn't just change the military situation. It transforms the entire psychology of the American Revolution. And it all starts with a single moment that most history books barely mention. It's 6 a.m. on May 10th, 1775. The British commander, Captain William de Laplace, is jarred awake by shouting and commotion in the courtyard. He stumbles out of his quarters, literally in his underwear, expecting to find his soldiers dealing with some minor disturbance. Instead, he comes face to face with Ethan Allen, this giant of a man holding a sword and surrounded by armed colonial fighters. De Laplace demands to know by what authority they are attacking his fort. In Allen's response, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress," the words echo off the stone walls of the fortress, and in that moment everything changes. But here's what makes this moment so historically significant. This is the first time anyone has claimed authority from the Continental Congress to attack a British position. Up until now, the Congress has been this tentative, diplomatic body trying to find peaceful solutions. But Allen's declaration transforms them into something else entirely, a revolutionary government with the power to authorize military action. The immediate military victory is stunning. They capture the fort without firing a single shot. 50 British soldiers surrender without a fight. They seize enough weapons to arm a small army, 78 cannons, 6 mortars, 3 howitzers, and thousands of pounds of gunpowder, but the real victory is psychological. And it spreads through the colonies like wildfire. Here's why this matters so much. For the first time since the Revolution began, the colonists have gone on the offensive. Lexington and Concord were defensive battles. Brave men defending their homes and families, but Fort Ticonderoga, this is the moment the colonists stopped reacting and started acting. The news spreads through the colonies with incredible speed. Riders gallop from town to town with the incredible message: the rebels took a British fort. In taverns and churches, in town squares and private homes, people are asking the same question: if a bunch of farmers can capture Fort Ticonderoga, what else might be possible? But here's where the story gets really interesting. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga sets in motion a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. Those cannons that Allen and Arnold captured, they are about to embark on one of the most incredible journeys in American history. Enter Henry Knox, a 25-year-old Boston bookseller who's about to attempt something that military experts will later call impossible. Knox volunteers to transport the captured artillery from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. A distance of over 300 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in North America, this isn't just a long march, this is the middle of winter through the Berkshire Mountains, across frozen rivers, and through dense forests. Knox is proposing to move 59 heavy cannons, each weighing thousands of pounds, using nothing but ox, drawn sleds, and pure determination. Military historians will tell you this can't be done. The cannons are too heavy, the distance too great, The weather too harsh, but Knox and his men don't read military history. They just start dragging cannons through the snow. For 2 months, through the worst winter in decades, Knox's expedition struggles through the wilderness. They build bridges across frozen rivers, construct ramps up mountainsides, and somehow manage to keep moving when any rational person would have given up. And then, on January 27, 1776, exactly 8.5 months after the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, something miraculous happens. The British commanders in Boston wake up to find rebel cannons positioned on Dorchester Heights, pointing down at their fleet and their army. The psychological impact is devastating. These are the same British officers who have been dismissing the colonists as untrained rabble. Now they're staring at professional artillery positions that appeared overnight, manned by rebels who somehow managed to transport heavy cannons across 300 miles of wilderness in the middle of winter. General William Howe, the British commander, reportedly stares at those cannons for a full minute before turning to his staff and saying, "The rebels have done something that a regular army could not have done." The implication is clear. These aren't just farmers with pitchforks anymore. This is a force capable of military operations that even trained armies would struggle to accomplish. Within days, the British begin their evacuation of Boston. The most powerful navy in the world, backed by thousands of professional soldiers, is retreating from a colonial port city. And it all traces back to that moment when 42 men scaled the walls of Fort Ticonderoga and decided that the impossible was actually possible. But the ripple effects go far beyond military strategy. The psychological transformation is profound. In colonial newspapers, in letters between friends, in sermons from pulpits across America, the same theme emerges. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they stand together for liberty. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga becomes the proof of concept for the entire American Revolution. It demonstrates that the British Empire, for all its power and prestige, is vulnerable. Vulnerable to determined, creative, and audacious action by people who refuse to accept that their situation is hopeless. Now comes the part that's going to hit you in the gut, because victory always comes with a price. And the price of Fort Ticonderoga was paid in blood, sacrifice, and heartbreak that most people never talk about. Let's start with Remember Baker, the man I told you about earlier, the farmer whose life was destroyed by British-backed land speculators. Remember survived the raid on Fort Ticonderoga, but his story doesn't have a happy ending. 3 months later, he's dead, killed in a skirmish with British loyalists near the Canadian border. But here's what breaks my heart about Remember Baker's death. He never lived to see American independence. He never got to witness the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He never saw the British surrender at Yorktown. He never experienced the freedom that his courage helped make possible. When Remember Baker died, he left behind a wife and 3 young children. His wife, Mary, was left to raise those children alone. In a world that branded her husband as a traitor, she had no pension, no government support, no recognition of her sacrifice. She was just a widow trying to feed her children in a society that saw her as the wife of a rebel. And here's the brutal truth. Mary Baker was one of thousands of women who paid this price. Behind every man who fought for American independence was a woman who held the family together, who kept the farm running, who raised the children alone while wondering if her husband would ever come home. But Remember Baker's story gets even more tragic. After his death, his children faced discrimination and hardship because their father was a known rebel. They couldn't get jobs, couldn't find marriage partners, couldn't build normal lives because they carried the stigma of being traitors' children. It took decades, literally decades, before American society began to honor these early patriots instead of treating them as criminals. Remember Baker's children grew up in a world where their father was simultaneously a hero and a traitor, depending on who was in power at the moment. Now let's talk about Noah Phelps, the spy who risked everything to scout Fort Ticonderoga. Phelps survived the war, but his life was never the same. Think about what it does to a man to live with the knowledge that he spent an entire day befriending British soldiers, laughing with them, sharing meals with them, all while planning their capture. Phelps never talked about his role in the Fort Ticonderoga raid. He went back to his farm, lived quietly, and took his secrets to the grave. His neighbors knew he'd been involved in the revolution somehow, but they never knew the full extent of his courage. He was a hero who chose anonymity over recognition, but here's what haunts me about Noah Phelps. He carried the psychological weight of that deception for the rest of his life. In his later years, according to family letters that still exist, he would wake up at night, sweating and calling out in his sleep. We'd call it PTSD today, but in 1775 they just called it the price of doing what needed to be done. And what about the tension between Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold? That personal conflict we saw at Fort Ticonderoga was a preview of the larger struggles the new nation would face. The question of leadership, authority, unity, these would plague American politics for decades. Allen went on to be captured by the British and spent 3 years in prison ships and British jails. He was offered pardons, bribes, threats, but he never broke. He emerged from captivity broken in body but unbroken in spirit, only to find that his war contributions had been largely forgotten. Arnold became America's most famous traitor. But here's what's interesting. The seeds of his eventual betrayal might have been planted right there at Fort Ticonderoga. The conflict over recognition, the struggle for authority, the feeling that his contributions weren't being properly valued. All of these themes would resurface later in his life. The psychological toll on these men was enormous. They'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They'd committed acts that made them traitors to the crown. And there was no going back. They lived with the knowledge that if the revolution failed, they would be hunted down and executed. But here's the part that really gets me. These men didn't know how the story would end. They didn't have the luxury of hindsight that we do. They didn't know that America would win the war, that the Constitution would be written, that their sacrifice would be honored by future generations. They acted on faith, faith that freedom was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible, faith that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stood together, faith that their children would live in a better world because of the risks they were taking. Consider the families of the men who participated in the Fort Ticonderoga raid. For months after the attack, they lived in constant fear of British retaliation. Their homes could be burned, their property confiscated, their lives destroyed if the British decided to make examples of them. Many of these families were forced to flee their homes and live as refugees. They lost everything, their farms, their businesses, their entire way of life, because their husbands and fathers had dared to attack a British fort. The economic cost was devastating. The Green Mountain Boys weren't paid soldiers. They were farmers and artisans who left their livelihoods behind to fight for liberty. While they were away at war, their crops rotted in the fields. Their businesses failed, and their families struggled to survive. But perhaps the greatest price was the psychological transformation these men underwent. They started as subjects of the British Crown, and in the space of a single night, they became American revolutionaries. They had to rebuild their entire sense of identity around the idea that they were no longer Englishmen. They were something new, something that didn't even have a name yet. The legacy of Fort Ticonderoga isn't just about military strategy or political theory. It's about human beings who looked at injustice and oppression and said, "Not anymore, not on our watch." It's about people who were willing to sacrifice everything they had for something they might never live to see. And that's the real lesson of Fort Ticonderoga. Freedom isn't free, it never has been, and it never will be. Every generation has to decide whether liberty is worth the price that must be paid to preserve it. The men who scaled those fortress walls in 1775 made that choice for their generation. The question is, what choice will we make for ours? Here's what strikes me most about the Fort Ticonderoga raid. These men didn't have a guarantee that things would work out. They didn't know that America would win the war, that the Constitution would be written, or that their sacrifice would be remembered. They acted on faith, faith that freedom was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible, faith that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they stood together. Today, we face our own challenges to liberty. We might not be scaling fortress walls at dawn, but we're still called to defend the principles that Remember Baker died for, that Noah Phelps risked everything to protect. The lesson of Fort Ticonderoga isn't just about military strategy or historical dates. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough of being pushed around. It's about the courage to take that first step. Even when you can't see the entire path ahead, those 83 men who crossed Lake Champlain that night weren't superhuman. They were farmers, hunters, merchants who decided that some things are worth risking everything for. And because of their courage, we live in a world where liberty isn't just an idea, it's a reality. The torch they carried that night is still burning today. The question is, what are we going to do with it? If this story of forgotten heroes and their incredible courage inspired you, hit that like button. It really helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. And if you want to dive deeper into the human side of American history, subscribe to Liberty Unfolded and ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. I want to hear from you in the comments. What modern situation reminds you of the courage shown at Fort Ticonderoga? When have you seen ordinary people stand up for what's right, even when the odds seemed impossible? And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, maybe someone who's forgotten that regular people can change the world, share this video with them. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding what we're capable of when we decide to act. Until next time, keep unfolding liberty, and remember, the story of freedom is still being written, and you're part of it.